Thank you very much, and all protocols observed. Welcome again to everyone. The next session you will see, there will be two speakers who essentially will complement the introductory remarks, the rich introductory remarks that Professor Bongani Mwajola had made. So after that, we will then have an opportunity for questions and answers around the three presentations. In other words, the introductory remarks, the keynote speaking notes, and then the other two lecturers that will be presenting now. In the afternoon, so just to distinguish this part of the proceedings from the afternoon proceedings, in the afternoon you will see that we will have all the speakers again as a panel. So we invite you to think about your contributions, your arguments, if you like, and leave them to the afternoon session when we will have this panel discussion. What you could be thinking of now, as you listen to the speakers, would be specific questions for clarity, questions for further elaborating on particular issues. So there will be this opportunity after you have listened to the two speakers that will now follow. I just draw your attention, if you have not noted it yet, at the back of the program, there is section, the very famous or infamous section 25. You could be also guided by that in your thinking. So the next speaker, as you see, is Advocate Lex Makua. Advocate Makua is a member of the Johannesburg and the Polokwane Bar, the Society of Advocates, and he has chambers in Sandton. He specializes in labor law, medical aid, constitutional and administrative law. He holds a postgraduate diploma in labor law and degrees B. Juris, LLB and LLM from the Walter Sisulu and Nelson Mandela Metropolitan Universities. He has worked as a public prosecutor, was the executive manager in South Africa's first democratic public service, that was under President Mandela. And later on, he was the National Legal Officer of the trade union NUMSA and a commissioner of our Commission for Conciliation, Mediation and Arbitration. He has further served as a member of the council of that other university, apart from UNISA here in the greater city of Tshwane, the Tshwane University of Technology. And he also as a commissioner of the very important National Planning Commission in the presidency. He is also a member of the National Association of Democratic Lawyers, NADEL, and he serves as on its international committee. Thank you very much for joining us, Advocate, and we look forward to your remarks.
Thank you, Program Director. Well, as I said, Professor Majola has taken everything that I was going to tell you. And in compliance with the law of tautology, I will jump what I was supposed to say in 20 minutes and say it in 5 minutes. Ladies and gentlemen, all protocol observed. Today I stand before you when our own politicians are voicing their opinions about expropriation of land with or without compensation, without the guidance of the voice of professionals like yourself. While politicians are known for enjoying the field of robustness, there's a need for us as professionals in various fields to map a destiny about this very important aspect, which guide us into understanding of what expropriation of land entails. I address you today on a topic which has gained prominence in the minds of my fellow South Africans, a topic which is becoming controversial and, if not managed well, divisive. A discussion about land ownership, property rights, and expropriation of land with or without compensation is a topic which raises emotions. It is our responsibility as South Africans in various fields of our own professions to be emotional, of course, about what belongs to us, but at the same time to remain responsible about our common destiny to build one nation. A debate about expropriation of land without mentioning our Constitution is bound to frustrate us. However, we are fortunate that our own democracy gave us Section 25 of our Constitution. Now, the issue which I would like to speak about today is whether is there a need indeed to amend the Constitution, or Section 25 of the Constitution is correctly placed to resolve issues of land equity in our country. To give context to an issue to be considered, it is important to deal with historical context of land inequity. The origin of land injustice in our country started in 1930 with the enactment of Natives Land Act 27 of 1930. This is the act which cast our country, its property regime, and made black South Africans foreigners in the country of their birth. Section 1 of the Act states, except with the approval of the Governor General, a native shall not enter into any agreement or transaction for the purchase, hire, or other acquisition from a person other than a native of any such land or of any right thereto, interest therein, or servitude thereof. Some in our country today tempt Native Land Act as an act of criminality or cruelty by the apartheid regime on black people. Whatever angle of debate one finds himself, the question of land ownership in terms of the Natives Land Act is bound to raise feelings of betrayal and emotions. As a result of the Natives Land Act, there are voices across the length and breadth of our country calling for expropriation of land without compensation. Such voices cannot be ignored, and we ignore them at our own peril. Within such voices, there are calls for solutions in the form of enacting a legislation similar to the Natives Land Act to redress the terrible effects on land ownership of black people. There are other voices calling for practical solutions within the ambit of our Constitution. Land in our country is real. land inequity in our country is real. And the question to ask ourselves is whether there should be constitutional amendment to cater for with a compensation for land without expropriation, or whether to use the provisions of the Section 25 to correct the effects of the Native Act 1930. Our current debates concerning expropriation of land with or without compensation, but the question always is what does expropriation mean? Our Constitution does not define what expropriation means, but we're fortunate. With the apex court in our country, the Constitutional Court, it has made it easy to define what expropriation really means. In one case of Huxley, the Court said expropriation is the compulsory acquisition of rights in property by a public authority. Ask yourself, what is a public authority? Now, further, that expropriation is the compulsory taking over of property by the state to obtain a public benefit at private expense. In other words, the Concord already it views expropriation as a compulsory. Now, there are three criteria for expropriation to happen in terms of Section 25. Two, these are: expropriation should be made in terms of law of general application. Do we have it now? Expropriation must be made in the public interest and for a public purpose. A just and equitable compensation. Now, ask yourself, when must compensation be made? Before expropriation or after expropriation? The first requirement will be met if state enacts a law of general application. The second requirement will be satisfied once expropriation is applied for purposes of land reform and other reforms to bring about equitable access to all South African natural resources. Now, again, it's important that we should know the interpretation which we must, as a country, use when we're dealing with Section 25 of the Constitution. Now, we have a case of the First National Bank, where the Concord said the historical context in which the property laws came into existence should be remembered. These provisions emphasize that under the Constitution, the protection of property as an individual right is not absolute. I wish politicians should know that. But is subject to societal considerations. Dealing now with the issue of compensation. In terms of Section 25(2)(b), property may only be expropriated subject to compensation, the amount of which and the time and manner of payment which have either been agreed to by those affected or decided or approved by the court. Who are those affected? It doesn't talk about landowner. It says those affected. Now, compensation is constitutionally valid. It's a constitutional validity of expropriation in terms of the provisions of Section 25(2)(b) of the Constitution. The questions, however, are, as I mentioned earlier on, when can compensation be made? Should compensation be made before expropriation or after expropriation? There is Act 63 of 1975, which is called the Expropriation Act. Now, the process of expropriation in terms of the above Act of 1975 is as follows. Now, since the enactment of Section 25 of the Constitution, since our government started the issue of land reform, always there are problems about the slow pace of land reform. But I'm going to just read for you what, in terms of the Act of 1975, how to handle expropriation. This is an act that predates Section 25 of the Constitution. Whether if you handle it in terms of that act, or the act is amended to make it to comply with the provisions of the Constitution, will we have a slow pace of delivering land equity? Now, it does. The process is as follows. 1. Once the minister has decided to expropriate, he starts with service of a notice of expropriation on the owner of the property. It doesn't take a week or 2 or a month. The notice must state the date of expropriation and the date upon which the state will take possession of the property. In other words, when the minister is issuing a notice, at the same time must be putting a date within the notice when expropriation will take place. The minister may offer an amount of compensation in the notice. Doesn't wait for 6 months to do market value of a property. When you issue a notice, within that particular notice, you put the amount you offer to the owner of the property. In the case of offer of compensation, the owner of the property must, not may, must, within 60 days from the date of the notice, deliver a written statement to the minister indicating either acceptance of the offer or the amount of compensation. If no offer has been made in the notice, the owner, there is a responsibility also on the part of the owner. The owner must similarly, within 60 days from the date of the notice, deliver a written statement indicating the amount of compensation. If the minister is not prepared to pay the amount claimed in these circumstances, he must within a reasonable period offer a revised amount of compensation. In those cases, where no compensation is offered in the notice and the owner did not indicate the amount claimed in response, the minister must within a reasonable period offer an amount of compensation. Where no final agreement is reached between the parties on the amount of compensation, the minister must give notice to the owner to make application to court before a certain date, failing which the owner shall be deemed to have accepted the offer made by the minister. So there's a responsibility on the part of the landowner not to wait what the minister must do, because if nothing happens, it's deemed. However, the issue of deemed, we might be having some problems with it in terms of the Constitution to interpret deemed clauses. Now, ownership of the property vests in the state on the date of expropriation, mentioned in the notice of expropriation. In terms of the Act, the state shall take possession of the property on a date stated in the notice of expropriation or on a date agreed between the parties. Now, currently, we have an expropriation bill that was adopted by our Parliament. Parliament adopted it. It was given to the President to sign it. After some time, that bill was referred back to Parliament. The reason for public participation. Now, the bill which which is before Parliament, it differs completely with the current Expropriation Act. However, I would like you to share something. The bill will be in the Department of Public Works, not in the Department of Land Affairs or Rural Development. Now, you have an Act of Government on Valuation. It's an Act of 2014. It appoints the Valuer General. That Act, it does not reside in the Department of Public Works. It resides in the Department of Land Affairs. The Valuer General, who is responsible for valuation of properties in terms of Section 25(3) and those other subsections A until E, reports to the Minister of Land Affairs, while the Expropriation Act resides with the Department of Public Works. I don't know how did this escape the mind or the eyes of our politicians. Now, we have the Estate Affairs Board that controls estate agents. Estate agents are the ones who used to value properties before they are sold. It falls under the Department of Human Settlement. Now, ask yourself, who is really making land reform to go slow? It isn't the landowners. It isn't us. There are those, of course, the blame should be put on the part of politicians. It is their core business. Legislation, rules, and everything where they are located, it is their core business. Will you sympathize with a striker of Bafana Bafana, who will be having a ball next to him, not defender, only a goalkeeper, but instead he puts a ball away. You can't, because this is his core business. Football is his core business. Now, our politicians, they must know one thing and one thing only. The issue of legislation, the issue of public participation, it is their core business. If it escapes their mind, they can't blame anybody. They can't blame the courts when the courts are approached by the landowners. Now, there's a case of Hafeji against the Itiquini municipality. This case was made in terms of Act 63 of 1975. Now, in this case, the municipality expropriated a property in terms of Act 63 of 1975. And Hafeji, the main thing in this case which was to be divided, to be decided, was when should compensation be made. Now, I have to be very careful here because Honorable Judge Pandra, who is here, I think he's aware of this case, as he was part of that particular case, where I might jump facts or omit to say everything. I will ask His Lordship to candidly, not here, just when we're aside, to say here he did not put it right. But what the Concord mentioned in this matter, it said as follows: the provisions of Section 25(2)(b in respect of compensation do not require that the amount of compensation and the time and manner of payment must, it is directory, must always be determined by agreement or by the court before expropriation under Section 25. So if any senior official in government, if any minister who fails to expropriate a property saying, no, we're still waiting to make payment, tell him, please go and check the Concord case of Hafeji. It says compensation, you can proceed with expropriation and do payment after. Now it says generally determination of compensation in accordance with the provisions of Section 25(3) before expropriation will be just and equitable. In those cases where compensation must be determined after expropriation, this must be done as soon as reasonably possible in accordance with the provisions of Section 25(3). So all what it requires is you can expropriate and you pay after, but after it will be within reasonable time. Now, the Concord made safeguards. They say in terms of Section 26 of the Constitution, in other words, the landowner, there will be expropriation, and from there, government or any other entity, it takes time to pay. However, in terms of the Concord judgment, they can evict the owner from the property. Now, that is a safeguard of expropriation and payment after. In that, until the issue of payment is made, the landowner cannot be evicted from the expropriated property. Now, this thing which a Professor Majola mentioned is the issue of the Valuation Act. It's bringing back the issue of willing seller, what is it, willing buyer, willing seller. It defines market value in this way. It says market value means the estimated amount for which the property should exchange on the valuation date between a willing buyer and a willing seller in an arm's length transaction after proper marketing and where the parties had each knowledgeably, prudently, and without compensation. So now, what are the recommendations which one could make to Parliament or to a ruling party in its policy conference? If I was there, I would say the issue of expropriation without compensation, while it might sound a good argument, it is not in the interest of the country. And I will refer them to what President Mandela said during the Codesa conference, or during Codesa, when he clashed openly with former President de Klerk on the issue of the arms struggle, where Mr. de Klerk mentioned the issue of arms struggle, that they should disband in an open gathering of this nature. They clashed openly. But when the outside media, they asked President Mandela about what happened, or whether is it the end of the negotiations or not. He mentioned something which is very important, which it seems some of us were forgetting. He says, we are not going to build our country in one day. I need Mr. de Klerk to build a new South Africa. We need each other. Just as we need land for purposes of food security, we need each other. There are voices on both sides. Those who will be saying, instead of sharing my land, I will move somewhere. Now, the Deputy Chief Justice Mr. Nege mentioned in one of his of these conferences. He said, land equity is real, and we need practical solutions to address it within the ambit of the Constitution. My comment, therefore, is amend Act 63 of 1975, the Expropriation Act, to make it to comply with the Constitution. The advantage is there is already a body of case law which interpreted that particular section. It has set aside uncertainties. Leave the issue of going to get a new act, Expropriation Act, which is new, which is going to be challenged, which is going to go from court to court until the Crown Court is going to delay the issue of expropriation, because it will be for the first time when we need clarity about various sections of this particular new act. Deal with the issue of valuation. The valuer general is a new concept. Take it and place it in the Department of Public Works. Make sure that the issue of valuation of property, it doesn't take long. It sits within one minister, it sits within one department. The issue of willing buyer, willing seller, it must not even appear in our eyes or be uttered in our lips, because it's bound to divide us forever. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Advocate Makwa. You've given us a very interesting perspective, and I'm sure food for thought. You've also mentioned the role of the politicians, and the next speaker, in a sense, is both a politician, and he really bridges the divide. I think the ambassador this morning said it's wonderful to see people who are from politics and from law, but our next speaker is from both these backgrounds. We could call him advocate, professor, doctor, honorable. He's on the program as Professor Mocheka Matole. He is currently the chair of the Parliamentary Portfolio Committee on Justice and Constitutional, or rather Correctional Services. The department changed, I think. He obtained the degrees B. Juris, LLB and LLD from UNISA, and the degree LLM at Harvard University in the United States, where he was a Fulbright scholar. He also did exchanges on the German Academic Exchange Program, and he visited the Max Planck Institute for Foreign and International Criminal Law. He is an advocate of the Supreme Court of South Africa, founder, member, and current chair and vice president of NADAL, the National Association of Democratic Lawyers. He is the person who first established the Community Law Advice Center in Mamelodi here in our city. He is and has become the ANC's member of the ANC's Legal and Constitutional Affairs Committee. He later became the ANC chair and the premier of this province, Gauteng. He later was elected also as a member of parliament, and during his time served as the chief whip of the ANC. And he's the founder of the Kara Heritage Institute, where the Community Law Center is located. He is widely published in arts, culture, history, and indigenous knowledge systems. He is also still teaching at UNISA, Freiburg, and UCT, and holds the position of adjunct professor in public law at the Nelson Mandela Metropolitan University. We thank him for his presence, and we look very much forward to his contribution to this debate. Thank you very much, Mr.
Program Director, let me acknowledge the organizers, Professor Quinton of Nelson Mandela Metropolitan University, Professor Felyun, of the Center for Human Rights, University of Pretoria, Makato Motseha, the director of the Community Law Center in the Kara Heritage Institute, but also acknowledge my colleague and mentor, Honorable Advocate Pumulwana, who is here with us, who is a member of Parliament and also a member of the Portfolio Committee on Justice and Correctional Affairs. But because politicians have been pointed out for something, you must stand up, they see you, so they know who to blame. You know, I'm actually delighted that the University of Pretoria was chosen to host this event, because there is someone amongst us that I want to refer to who has done something that many of us were afraid to do. You know, when people want to find somebody guilty of what has gone wrong in our country, they quickly say, no, 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 it is these Boers, it is the Afrikaners. But they don't wait and find out whether these Boers were just problems but also solutions providers. You know, there was a big debate in the country during the 80s when apartheid was facing a crisis. And the question was, where do we go from there? Because O.R. Tambo had called on the masses of this country to make the country ungovernable, and P.W. Botha had delivered a Rubicon speech, and the two speeches really indicated that we have reached a stalemate and the only option was war. But it took a young academic, Johan van der Westhuizen, who founded the Center for Human Rights at this university. Professor, I said young, but you are no longer young. Maybe you should stand up, they see that you are no longer young. You know, Professor van der Westhuizen decided that this impasse can be broken through dialogue. And in 1986, he went to Lusaka to meet the ANC and said, no, we need dialogue, but we need your support in this dialogue. And another mentor of mine, Beas Nodi, also he was a priest, went to Lusaka and said, no, we need dialogue. And I'm honored that I was associated with both of them. And on the 1st of May 1986, here at the University of Pretoria, there was a symposium on human rights. But now the question arose whether we need human rights or group rights. And that engagement, facilitated by Professor van der Westhuizen, and on the other side with Professor John Dugat from VETS, actually opened an open debate on human rights versus group rights. And the advocates of human rights succeeded, and in 1987 the ANC issued a statement on negotiations which rejected group rights and opted for human rights. But in the process towards the 90s, the Nationalist Party also accepted the idea of human rights. So I say this because that process of the acceptance of human rights by all South Africans started here at the University of Pretoria, and therefore I'm not a Sangoma or a prophet. I want to believe that this symposium at the University of Pretoria will also lead to a situation where a solution will be found on the critical issue of land. And I have been encouraged by the two leading thinkers here, Professor Majola and Advocate Makua, who have indicated that actually we have no crisis. The crisis is caused by myself and Honorable Mpumulwana, who have the power to make the law, but we are not making the right law, and also who have the right to consult those who know, and we have not consulted those who know. But also, I just want to lay down, especially for the young people, that you see, sometimes propaganda works, and according to propaganda, the problems that we have started because there were Afrikaner people in the country who are today South Africans. But I want to read you a quote which will show you that the British were the causes of our problem. And then the Afrikaners inherited the problem from the British and refined it. On the 2nd of February 1835, Lord Macaulay addressed the British Parliament and said the following, I quote, "I have traveled across the length and breadth of Africa. I have not seen one person who is a beggar, who is a thief. Such wealth I have seen in this country, such high moral values, people of such caliber, that I do not think we would ever conquer this country unless we break the very backbone of this nation, which is her spiritual and cultural heritage. And therefore, I propose that we replace her old and ancient education system, her culture, for if the Africans think that all that is foreign and English is good and greater than their own, they will lose their self-esteem, their native culture, and they will become what we want them, a truly dominated nation. Now, if you see what is happening at our institution of higher learning, in our schools, where everybody who is dissatisfied first destroy what they need most, the books, the clinics with medicine. You can see what the British have achieved but blamed the Afrikaners for doing. Now, I therefore want to talk about the problem of racism, because it is racism that led us to where we are. This year we are celebrating the life and times of Oliver Reginald Tambo. Tambo told the World Council of Churches in Holland in June 1980 that racism has been used to justify land disposition and turning African people into instruments of labor and justifying the white minority rule. But it's also not enough just to blame racism. We need to know, where did racism come from? You see, there is nothing wrong with the Bible, but there's something wrong with the illiterate interpreters of the Bible, who developed something that was called the Hermetic Hypothesis. The Hermetic Hypothesis says that one man called Noah survived the flood. He had 3 children, Japheth, Ham, and Shem, and that African people descended from Ham, who laughed at the nakedness of his father, and therefore they were cast and made black, and therefore they were condemned to be the slaves or drawers of wood, of water, and hewers of wood for Asian and white people. According to that interpretation, Africans cannot and should not be anything except the servants of Asian and white people. And I want to say that was a misinterpretation of the Bible, because Africans did not descend from Noah. Noah came from Asia. Africans came from Africa. And the ancestors of Africans were never in Asia. They were in Africa. That's why they are called Africans. And according to the Bible, the history of Adam dates back to the year 4004 BC, and the history of Africa dates back to 36,000 years BC. So Africans could not have descended to somebody younger. So it means, therefore, that the people who were cast were not Africans. They were some other people. And Africans are not black because of a curse. Africans are black because it's very hot in Africa. And therefore, having shown, and there's literature to that effect, that Africans were never cast, that young people must disabuse themselves of any wrong with their color, and they shouldn't even try to change that color. Now, there was another problem also that came with the church. What the church said, actually, these were conservative Protestant Christians who said that every human being has a divine spark that came from the divine light or God of light. But the only people who don't have the divine spark are Africans. And therefore, Africans were subhuman beings. And they cannot be treated as equal to other human beings. So, for the second time, then the church creates this inferiority of or subhumanity of African people. Now, that's why there was discrimination, racism and discrimination in both the church and state institutions. Then came another guy called Darwin, who said there's evolution and the competition, survival of the fittest. And it is surprising that even today that science is so advanced, you still have people who believe that human beings develop out of apes. But these apes now no longer develop into human beings. Who stopped them? Why did they stop such a powerful development? So all these theories are created by people who don't want peace in the world. But there are two guys who also added to our problems. That was Cecil John Rhodes and Lord Milner, who imported young students from University of London to come and propagate these ideas. And then those are the people, Cecil John Rhodes and Lord Milner, who actually laid a firm foundation for racism, colonialism in this country. Now, you know, African people never accepted racism and their subhumanity or inferiority. That's why in 1892, Reverend Mangena Maakemukoni established the Ethiopian Church of South Africa, which rejected all these theories. And in same year, 1892, Reverend Langali Balele Dube gave a public lecture where he said he's seeing a new Africa which will be spiritual, humane, and prosperous. Now, in 1896, there was the Italian fascists attacked Ethiopia, and they were defeated by Emperor Menelik. And African people saw that it is possible to defeat the people who were not cursed, and they were encouraged now to fight for their freedom. Now, in 1897, Sylvester Williams established the African Association. 1898, Arthur McNeill Turner came to South Africa. He converted many priests to preach Ethiopianism and Pan-Africanism. Then 1899, the Anglo-Boer War broke out. African people fought on the side of the Boers and the Britons, hoping that after the war, they will be given their rights. But 1902, the Boers and the Britons concluded the Treaty of Vereeniging, which institutionalized racism. Now, between 1900 and 1905, black people realized that to fight racism and colonialism, you need to be organized. And then they formed the Native Congresses, which came together in 1912 to form the African National Congress, the ANC. But to show that young people, if they don't just break down things, can change the world. In 1905, a young man called Pixley Isagaga Seme gave a speech in Columbia University titled The Regeneration of Africa. He said that he sees the dawn of a new country. He sees the birth of a unique, a new and unique civilization for Africa and Africans. And it was that man who laid the foundation for the African Renaissance that President Mbeki and others are running with now. Now, he also said that the glories of ancient Ethiopia and Egypt were the product of the African genius. And that's why the books that you read in the universities today will never associate any African with Egypt or Ethiopia. Because if that were to be done, it would mean that you were never inferior, and that actually you produced a civilization that actually produced what is falsely called Western civilization. Now, in 1909, then we had an agreement between the Boers and the Britons to pass the South Africa Act, which provided for the creation of the Union of South Africa, a racist union which excluded black people from government and which destroys the African social systems that are referred to by this Lord Macaulay. Now, in 1913, then the Land Act was passed. What needs to be borne in mind, and what is the reason why we have problems today, is that the South Africa Act allocated only 7% of the total surface of South Africa to African people, who were more than 80% of the population. And then crowding resulted, and the 7% was increased to 13%, which was also far from adequate. Now, African people decided that they have to challenge this. Luckily, they had formed the ANC in 1912, and now 1914 Marcus Garvey formed the United Negro Improvement Association, UNIA. Unfortunately, World War I broke out, and again African people took part in that war, hoping that after the war they will regain their civil and political rights. And what happened is that the League of Nations went ahead as if Africans never existed, and the Garveyan movement then. But despite that, Sefako Makgato, the second president of the ANC, called for a non-racial South Africa, which means the fact that they were dispossessed of land by white people, oppressed by white people, did not make Africans racists. They called for a non-racial society. The 1921 Reverend Zacchaeus Mahabane said that racism and colonialism have degraded and dehumanized the African people. And he said the only solution is the recovery of the African humanity, Ubuntu Butu, as a prerequisite for the recovery of the humanity of all South Africans. In 1923, he prevailed on the National Conference of the ANC to adopt a Bill of Rights. Now, during the 20s, Garvey catalyzed the birth of the Negro or Harlem Renaissance. And Nelson Mandela says that he, Kwame Nkrumah, and Mnandi Azikiwe were profoundly influenced by that Renaissance. Now, in 1937, Azikiwe of Nigeria wrote a book called Renaissance Africa, where he condemned the suppression of the contribution of African heritage to human civilization, but said that Africa is not blighted forever, that Africa will be reborn, renewed, and developed. In the same year, William Nkomo from Atteridgeville here he told a women's conference that African people are not a subhuman being, and that they too are entitled to the right of self-determination. Then World War II broke out, and Africans again fight on the side of the Allied forces. But even before the war was won, you heard about the Mendy ship that sank in Europe, defending Europeans' rights of self-determination. But even before the war was over, Winston Churchill of England and Theodore Roosevelt of the United States issued the Atlantic Charter, which gave the right of self-determination to Eastern Europe rather than Africans. Now you can see that racism was not started by the Afrikaner people. It was an international crime led by the Americans and the British. And now today they want to stand on the sides and say we sympathize with you. These Afrikaners created problems and they brought racism. They are the authors of racism. Even the philosophy behind it came from them. And the fact that we fought in the Anglo-Boer War, in the World War I, World War II, for no reward except maybe bicycles here and there, didn't matter. But you see, young people are very important, because it was young people led by the Mandela, Tambo, Sisulu, and others who in 1943 prevailed on the ANC to adopt the African claims, which demanded the right of African people to self-determination and human rights. In other words, the ANC developed human rights charters before the formation of the United Nations in 1945. And in the same year, 1945, the Fifth Pan-African Congress was held, which called on the African masses to use all means in their power to liberate themselves. In 1948, then the Nationalist Party comes into power on the platform of apartheid. And in the same year, the UN had adopted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. They ignored that, and then they established an apartheid state, adopted all laws that are against humanity. But again, the young people of this country, led by the Mandelas, they prevailed on the ANC National Conference to adopt the program of action which demanded the right of African people to self-determination and the restitution of land and its natural resources. It was that program that laid the foundation for the defiance campaigns of the early 50s. Now, 1954, women adopted the Women's Charter. And you will remember that Charlotte Maxeke, as early as 1918, formed the Bantu Women's League. In 1930, she said women's rights are also human rights. 1955, then you have the Freedom Charter. Let me leave history now and say, what is all this? What does all this mean to ourselves? I want to say that the situation that we are facing is not only a situation of human rights. It's a situation of human and people's rights. Because as individuals, we need individual rights. Those individual rights are human rights. But together as the people of South Africa, black and white, we need certain rights which belong to us not as individuals but as a people. And as a people, we need the right to decide who must govern us and how we must be governed. We need the right to decide what culture, what spiritual and cultural values we want to guide our country. And then we need the right to decide how land should be distributed and managed. And therefore, we as South Africans don't only need human rights or individual rights, we also need people's rights. So the Freedom Charter is a balanced document. It provides for human and people's rights. And it contains all human rights that are contained in the 1996 Constitution of the Republic. But if you look at the Bill of Rights in our Constitution, It has captured everything that the ANC developed from 1923, 1943, and 1955. Now, after giving us all these rights, now it provides for Section 25 of the Constitution. I think more learned people than me have interpreted that Section 25, and I fully agree with them and disagree with myself and my government. But I want to say that they have actually managed to lay a very firm foundation, free of charge, a foundation on which, as government, we can take the country forward without unnecessary conflict. But I just want to, before I sit down, take this opportunity to make some observations because I want to focus on heritage. You see, democracy is new, and I tend to think that we have, in some senses, over-democratized, and that's why we have problems. We, in terms of Section 25, we made the Land Restitution Act and created a very huge bureaucracy. Every province has a Land Restitution Commission with big offices, with staff, and then that act says, before you can get your land back, there must be an investigation, and then there must be a mediation where you don't agree, and then the commission must refer matters to court. And how many matters arrive in court? Very little, if anything. It would seem somebody is a stumbling block in those commissions. And they hide behind the fact that the people don't agree. So they want maximum agreement amongst the people. How do you expect people who are competing for land to agree? You have to listen to them like the judges do and then decide. But it's not happening. And the other problem is that young people are employed to investigate. Well, I've been reading the reports all the time. When you read these reports, you can see that these young people don't know even the history of this country. Because if you don't know the history of this country, you won't be able to resolve the problems facing the country. So I want to submit that if we have to move forward, in addition to what my learned colleagues are saying, we don't need the bureaucracy created by the Land Restitution Act. Is wasting our time, is planting a time bomb in our country. So we must scrap those laws, maybe just put one commission and then headed by judges, and those who want their land must go and make submissions before that panel of judges, and they will deal with them. And if you are not happy, then you can go to the Land Claims Court. But I have also been accused of criticizing the judges in the Land Claims Court. I don't doubt the competence of those judges. I doubt the competence of my own government, because if you deal with a sensitive matter like land, you cannot go and put senior white judges and Indian judges in a land claims court, because the rule says justice must be done and it must soon be done, to be done. Now, when poor land claimants lose their cases, they are going to blame the white judges and Indian judges as if those judges did not apply the law correctly. So we must not damage the integrity, the image of the judges and the judiciary by deploying them wrongly. So I would also therefore call for a proper constitution of the Land Claims Court so that these processes can move faster. The last point I want to make is that I cannot really understand our understanding of African society. In the African society, there was a social system and political system. That social system would have a king or a queen at the head, and there would be senior traditional leaders, and there would be headmen and women. They would form one system. But this idea of introducing the governor general, later called the president, making them the supreme chiefs, and then destroying African kingship and queenship, has made senior traditional leaders independent. And now the people who were dispossessed of the land were the kings and queens with the senior traditional leaders under them. Now today we give the people the right to claim the land. How do you claim? We say a person, that's what the Constitution says, any person or community can lodge a claim for land. But that person is a member of the community. Why a person, not the community? And if it's the community is not the tribes created by apartheid colonialism. The community are groups led by the headmen, the senior traditional leaders, and the king. Now, our approach leads to a situation where you can have 25 claims within the same community, and that creates conflict. But another thing is when you say individuals can claim, then you end up with CPAs, Community Property Association, and we made a law to facilitate that. And all these ill-conceived arrangements have created the problems of slow process that we are talking about. So I think that whilst we do what has been suggested by advocate here and the professor, I think there are some unnecessary laws that we have passed which are delaying the process, and that is not in the interest of this country and its people, because once you see impatience at the level of the presidency, you see impatience at the level of political leaders who themselves fail to speed up the process. This impatience is going to spread into the ordinary people. Then you are going to have unrest and perhaps even violence because of the negligence of the leadership. So I want to agree with my learned friends that I think that Section 25 of the Constitution is not the problem. The problem is with those of us who are charged with the responsibility to implement that section and also to make enabling legislation for the implementation of that section. So you have empowered me, and I know that Honorable Mpumulwan, when we go to Parliament, I think we'll be singing from the same hymn book. We will push what our learned friends have said, and then if we are expelled from Parliament because of the radical positions we take. I hope the University of Nelson Mandela University and University of Pretoria will offer us some area to teach some paralegal courses so we won't be unemployed. And thank you very much.
So thank you very much for those wide-ranging and very, I think, interesting and provocative remarks. May I ask the three speakers then to please join us here so that we can invite the audience to pose any specific questions. As I said, maybe there is a bit of a lack of clarity between making comments and asking questions, but let us try to devote the session to trying to understand and clarify issues, and then we'll have a slightly earlier lunch. So we'll still have the session for about 30 minutes. At about 12:30, if the lunch is ready, we will break for lunch, and then we will just come back a little bit earlier as well, maybe at 13:30, so that we will perhaps have a slightly earlier ending for the day. But for the moment, Advocate Makua, Professor Mochekga, and Professor Majola, if you could join us, please. And then we are having a roving microphone, I think. And we will then see who would like to pose any questions or perhaps also put anything to the speakers.
I need protection. I'll sit
Okay, so the floor is open. You're most welcome. Any issues arising? Maybe we also ask that as you take the floor, you'll just maybe say who you are, identify yourself, maybe just with one sentence, and then pose your question or make your specific comment to any one of the presenters, please. You're most welcome. Am I blinded by the light so I don't see many hands? I think what we, just while you are thinking, what we also, as I think, came to focus on is that when we talk about this issue of land reform and land restitution, certainly Section 25 is a starting point, but one has to take it in context with the legislation that is obviously also very relevant. Maybe I can ask the first question just for Advocate Makua. That's really just maybe for our clarification. We have the 1975 Expropriation Act, and now we have the process before Parliament, essentially the Expropriation Bill. Could you perhaps just highlight, as far as you see it, the main differences between those two? Because I think you mentioned that there are clear, and there would be clear differences. If that law, as it is on the table now, if it is adopted, essentially how would it change in the main, if you would like? The situation. That's one issue that I thought could just clarify something for us, but maybe we take one or two further questions or comments, issues that you would like to raise, and then we take it to the speakers. If not, then let's start, Advocate Makua, if you don't mind. We'll start with you. I think let's just use that mic. Thank you very much.
Thank you. When you look at the bill which will return Parliament, it gives the minister powers, but a lot of powers it gives to officials. It emphasizes a lot of time on investigations. And what Professor Mr. mentioned, that bureaucracy is the one that slowed pace for land reform. But if you look, the Act 63 of 1975, it immediately puts the minister on the spot. The minister issues a notice. The notice, it indicates a date when expropriation will happen. It also puts the amount, the offer, which the other party could put. But the bill, it doesn't have those kind of things. You still need to go and investigate the amount. Once everything happened, you still come and decide when is the date for operation. So it really takes us back. And I can tell you, it's going to be challenged, not because of abuse of court process, but because everybody would like to know what particular process mean. Now, when you're having already an act, I think there is sometimes something wrong, or let me say not wrong. There's something which ourselves as South Africans, we seem to think that everything that was created in the past is bad. You know, without looking at the advantages thereof. It has already been interpreted by a lot of court. There are court pronouncements on it. So if we just take it, we just put some measures so that it complies with particular sections in the Constitution, like deemed, I think it will help us. But the main thing is that the bill is more on the officials' investigations and everything. Now, whom are you going to hold to account if there is no expropriation? Unlike this Act 63, where it puts the minister. If the minister is not doing his work, then you are able, at the end of whatever term, members of parliament, members of the public, to hold him or her to account. So the problem there is investigations. Investigations in law, we always call it a delay tactic. Get to the bottom of whatever you want. Always, you must know the issue you want to deal with and handle it.
Thank you very much. Yes, please, we have a hand there. Just introduce yourself and pose the question. That's very welcome. Please, you set a good precedent. Thank you.
I'm Ethel Phillips, Goodwill Ambassador for Women and Children under National Interfaith Council of South Africa, put in place by Kara Heritage Institute, NICSA, and Presidency. I just want to say that in view of what we are discussing now, what is the observation of the presenters this morning concerning placing back or demarcation or allocation of areas such as mines, game reserves, rivers, mountains, Table Mountain of course. Who is going to own that? And oceans. How are we going to have the coastlines demarcated when we look at who was the original owner of these areas? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I see another hand. If you would, please just hand the microphone there and we do the same. Thank you so much. We'll take maybe a round of 3 questions.
I'm Anila Kumara from Woodsman's, attorneys in Sandton. This is addressed to Professor Mochecha. are we not being too hard on ourselves in relation to the issue of restitution? Are we to understand that restitution is the only way to which to restore the dignity of the African people? Should it not be a more holistic approach? Because once people have land, then what? If people are still uneducated or hungry, should we not be having a more holistic approach to restoring identity across the board? And maybe then we wouldn't be so hard on the Commission and their efforts in relation to restitution. Then my second question is, I'm sure you've, this is to the entire panel. We are currently looking at the Land Holdings Bill, which seeks to limit foreign land ownership. Do you think there should also be a limit on private land ownership? Because as you know, the Land Holding Bill only looks at agricultural land. Should there be a look at other places where we focus on on properties or land such as what Cape Town is and the great disparity in the ownership there?
Thank you very much. I think we take the last question here before we revert to the panel. Yes, please, and we'll come back to others. Yes.
Okay, thank you very much for the opportunity.
Maybe you follow the example of the others so everyone can see you posing the question, if you don't mind.
Okay, sorry about that. Thank you very much for the opportunity to ask a question. My question is directed to everybody on the panel. The question is, what are the disadvantages and advantages of combining the Department of Cooperative Governance and the Rural Development and Land Restitution to work together to reinstate both the land and the chieftains? Thank you.
And you are?
Lieutenant Robert from Community Law Center.
Thank you so much. So yes, please. I think we'll go around the panel for those. I think it's essentially 4 questions. The first about the extension to mines, Table Mountain, and broadly game reserves and so on. The second about the whether the issue of looking at issues holistically and not being too hard on the failings as perceived by the Commission and so on. Then the question about the Land Holdings Bill and the extension beyond agricultural land, and then the last question about the collaborative endeavors within government structures and how that will facilitate the process further. So I don't know if we can just take perhaps the sequence that we had. Professor Majola, if you would start with any of those to respond to, and then we'll just come down to the panelists.
Excuse me, thank you very much. I'll tackle the question from the Goodwill Ambassador, Ethel. What observations with regard to the ownership and demarcation of game reserves, mines, rivers, and so on? Well, I may be accused of socialism, but I think that it would help us with the redistribution of wealth. Some of these rights belong to communities rather than to individuals, because when they belong to individuals, individuals tend to hoard. When they belong to communities, communities can benefit from any revenues that are obtained from that. You spoke of Table Mountains. There's a lot of money that comes out of that. And my belief is that if we were to have an arrangement in terms of in which it's the community that owns the property, but it's the community that takes hold of those, then there is a possibility of greater redistribution. Having said that, I'd like to warn myself that one is treading, has to tread very carefully, because sometimes these are the sources from which the very state that we say has to realize these rights draws its revenues from. Yes, I think that if they belong to the community, it would serve a better purpose than you find them belonging to an individual. Secondly, there was a question about whether there should be any limit to individual land ownership. I really do believe that there should be a limit to individual land ownership. There are so many people who need land, and the land does not increase. We just have land as a limited resource. And if we would like to achieve the aspirations of many people who would like to have access to land, we have to deal with the issue of how much land should one individual be allowed to own. How we redistribute that is another question. My sense is that perhaps it's an issue that we might need to think about further down the line.
Sorry, I don't know anything.
Thank you.
I just want to say that one of the things that the Constitution recognizes is the freedom of religion. Now, if during Easter and Christmas, if you want to know where the majority of people go to pray, you will find them in the caves at the foot of mountains. You will find them on the top of mountains. That's why the two Lekhanyanis build their headquarters at the foot of mountains. That's why Shembe is praying at the top of the mountain, to show that mountains should be owned by people because they are needed by people, not individuals. And the other thing is that our heritage is also associated with mountains. If you go to Limpopo, you have a mountain called Makonde. It is a cave of the goddess called Nwariwedega, the Queen of Heaven, which means that if the goddess wants to visit the people, the goddess goes into the cave in Mount Makonde. If you want to Mount Luonde next to Albacinda, you will find a cave where the goddess goes. So in other words, the African religion is not separable from the mountain and the caves. So if someone is going to own those mountains, then that person will be denying the majority of the people the right to worship. The lakes, if you go to Limpopo, you find the lake Funduzi. When the rain goddess wants to visit Queen Ujaji, the rain goddess goes to Lake Funduzi to wash. Now, if you want to take that lake and give it to individuals, then you are denying the people the right to religion. So there are certain natural things that can only or must only belong to the people as a whole. And therefore, I want to agree with the professor's observation on this ownership to say, therefore, human rights alone, which are individual rights, are not adequate. We need human and people's rights. And that's why the African Union saw it fit to pass the Charter on African and people's rights. And I'm happy that the new chair of the South African Human Rights Commission is very much alive to that, because in the past some people tend to support international instruments and neglect African instruments which recognizes both women and people's rights. But with the collapsing some government departments together, I don't think the problem is that this department are separated. It may be part of the problem. Because in government you have clusters, which ensures that departments having common interests work together. Apparently that is not happening. That's why we heard from the advocates that one piece of legislation is with public works and another piece in another department, whereas the issue that they're addressing is the same issue, but the competence is scattered all over. And sometimes we find that government departments like portfolio committees, which we are part, don't talk to each other, and that causes delays. But I'm not rejecting the notion that maybe some of these departments must be put together, and perhaps that's why we're talking here, that we hear from yourself what we do wrong and what we must correct. Yeah, holistic, that's the last question. You are right. We must address these matters holistically. But unless the land question is at the center, because if you can drive from Mamelodi, from Kalina, you see at the increasing number of squatter camps, which are supposed to be human settlement. You pass, you go to Tembisa, you go to Joburg. The whole of Gauteng is becoming a big slum. And today, when people die in our settlements, the ambulance cannot reach the place to carry the corpse. When crime is committed, the police cannot access the places because there is no land. And some municipalities are selling the land to foreigners. So I want to argue that the settlement of the land question will unlock opportunities for all of us, will provide solutions that will not cost us anything. But a holistic approach is the approach to follow, but we need to facilitate access to the land and its natural resources, then we'll be fine. Lastly, Program Director, you can see this triple challenge of poverty, unemployment, and inequality has created a deepening moral degeneration. People are marrying their grandchildren, or they are just sleeping with their grandchildren, and you find that people drink from Friday to Saturday. There's general chaos, and that chaos was foreseen by the founders of our Constitution. So things are not right, largely because there's no access to land and to its natural resources. Holistic, but let's make better there.
Thank you so much. I see, yes, Mr. Baidu, and then yes, just introduce yourself and pose the question.
Hello, my name is Stephen. I'm part of the master's program proceeding to democratization and human rights in Africa. I just have two particular questions. So firstly, it deals with what particular land are we necessarily speaking of when we talk about this notion of expropriation. It seems that the land question is predominantly focused on rural tenements, so land which can be used for farming, etc. It doesn't necessarily seem to focus on urban tenements. And this question arises from an extract of Justice Mukhwin's, not Justice Mukhwin, I mean the ex-Chief Justice's book, where he talks about the sacking of middle-class, affluent black people from Selby, and which is now basically an urban settlement for predominantly affluent, middle-class, white individuals. So in that instance, when we speak about expropriation of land, do you think the issue is fully dealt with if we predominantly focus on rural tenements instead of urban tenements, which we know full well that many black people were also chased from such urban settlements and not purely farms and as well? The second question then goes with this whole issue about Article 25 and the assertion that Article 25 is not the main issue, and that the main issue is the procedural and the exhaustive, should we say, bureaucratic problems. But don't you think that the text of Article 25 and the purpose of a neoliberal constitution envisions this exhaustive procedural safeguards, in the sense that can we actually separate the text of Article 25, the purpose of the Constitution, and the exhaustive list of procedural safeguards put in place to protect the individual from the arbitrary influence of the state and the arbitrary interference of the state. And so therefore, when we question the text of Article 25, are we not then also questioning the whole purpose of the Constitution as a whole, with regards to the way in which it elevates the individual to such an extent that even community interests cannot encroach upon that, and therefore we need to put all these procedural safeguards in place. So how do we in fact say that the procedural safeguards are the issue and not Article 25, when Article 25 might result in the procedural safeguards? Thank you.
Thank you very much. And another question there. I think we'll take one more.
Good morning. I think it is still good morning. My name is Bulelo Mabasa. I'm from Worksman's Attorneys. I'm a director at Worksman's Attorneys. And my main area of interest has and continues to be in land restitution, or broadly speaking, land reform. I've also had the pleasure of working with Professor Honorable, what was the other title?
Advocate
Muchecha, in a heritage-related matter, which did involve a protection of a well-known mountain in Limpopo as against a rise of a mine. But the reason I'm speaking is not to touch on that. I have a couple of things in mind. The first is a follow-up from Stephen's question, which is this. Why are we afraid to form a different paradigm shift, a mental shift that says, why are we married to the concept of individual ownership? Why is it sinful to envisage a country where land stops being a concept that is linked with individual ownership? Why is it sacrilege? We're already doing that in the context of natural resources, where our laws were changed to create a mechanism where natural resources are not attached to individual ownership. An individual or company or even a community that wishes to have access to minerals has to do so by licensing out from the state. Why is it a different discussion when it comes to land? So that's my first question. And yes, I do understand that the licensing of mineral resources is not a perfect system, but at least we've got something in place that we can use as a guiding principle when it comes to the issue of land. The second issue is, as I said, linked to what Stephen has said, which is we must not be afraid to discuss the tension that exists within Section 25. The reason that within Section 25 individual land ownership seems to have reigned supreme is precisely because individual owners are the same people that have access to courts. They have access to good legal representation, as opposed to communities which are now recognized in the bottom section of Section 25, which is from Section 25, subsection 7 downwards, as opposed to Section 25, subsection 1. So yes, we do have a conflict within Section 25. And yes, the last 21 years or so have actually been proof that Section 25 has worked fundamentally in favor of those individual owners or companies that are able to access the courts in defending or at least holding on to individual land ownership. So I don't believe that Section 25 should be an untouchable clause in the Constitution, because if that were to be our premise, we are asserting the society is static, that when we make laws and experience shows us that those laws haven't worked perfectly, we must leave those laws as they are. And my submission is that that cannot be. And also raising the argument does not mean that we're being undemocratic or that we're being disloyal to our Constitution. It means that as society develops and as things change, so too must the discussions that we have about the utility of those clauses and those sections. Lastly, if we assume, if our starting point is that Section 25 is perfect, we are essentially saying that the people of South Africa must fund compensation as a model. Because when we say compensation must remain, we're saying that the state must fund for compensation, but who is the state and how do those funds come about? So it becomes a circular argument. I'm proposing for a out-of-the-box paradigm shift. The Constitution did what it needed to do in Section 25. We sit here 20 years later. Even if we were to have the suggestions that are made by the panel, have one department, have one commission, even if we were to have all of that, for as long as we have inequality at the root of a problem, Section 25 remains a very elusive target that we'll never find a solution for.
Thank you very much. So, doing a disservice to the posers of the question, let me summarize the three questions and just invite the speakers to briefly respond. So our plan is to break for lunch now and then resume the more fundamental discussions after lunch. The first question, I think, was about the limitation of the discussion to rural land. Where does urban possession and entitlements figure? The second, more simple question was around the paradigm shift that is required away from individual ownership to collective land ownership, and what prevents that kind of paradigm shift. And I think the third, more fundamental question, combining the two interveners, was about the very essence of Section 25, whether it doesn't invite us to see it necessarily as a new liberal part of a new liberal constitution, whether you can divorce Section 25 and what it stands for from the basic tenure of the constitution, how it is linked to the limited access that certain people have to use the constitution, and how that somehow would always perpetuate certain existing privileges, and inviting us to think kind of radically outside the box and not be so transfixed by the allure of Section 25. So maybe we take the same sequence for any of your responses to those.
Thank you. I will try to answer some of the questions and leave others. It does appear that there is a bigger focus on rural land as opposed to claiming restitution on urban land. My sense is that the reason for this is that in most cases it was rural land that was dispossessed, and people tend to apply for the return of that land. But it does not mean that urban land is not the subject of focus here for restitution. I'm thinking, for example, one big example, therefore, is the dispute with regard to the restitution of the District 6, what we call in Cape Town. There may be other areas. I haven't been following the particular cases, but I know that District 6 was one of those areas. I still believe that Section 25, strictly speaking, is not the main issue. And that in understanding Section 25, you cannot divorce the history that one has tried to outline, namely that the people who already have the possession of land wanted to ensure that they do not lose possession of land under the new democratic regime, and therefore insisted on the entrenchment of the right to property. And that if that had not been the case, we wouldn't be having all these difficulties with regard to restitution. The safeguards that you are talking about are safeguards that were put in place partly also to ensure that the right that the landowners wanted to preserve was actually preserved. So in my view, I think that those procedural safeguards that we are talking about have to be understood in that context. But besides all that I've said, Section 25.8 has to be given some kind of meaning, of interpretation. What does it mean? You know, because it starts by saying no provision of this section. It says no provision of this section may impede the state from taking legislative and other measures to achieve land, water, and related reform. So, notwithstanding Section 25, the state can still do what it needs to do, provided that, you know, it follows the constitutional imperatives that are in our constitution. So I do not see, therefore, that if Section 8 was not there, yes, I'll definitely agree with you. Number one. Number two, Section 25 does, and as interpreted by the courts, does not require market-related compensation. I have said in my presentation that the state can actually give limited compensation. My sense is that it can give compensation, you know, which is fair but quite low, and that should be fine. I do not think that when we speak about compensation, we're speaking about large sums of money. So in a way, I think it is possible that from the taxes that we pay, the state can pay compensation, but limited, you know, looking at especially the manner in which the property was acquired, and limited to very low amounts, and then taking accordingly.
Thank you. Yes, I think I agree with you, Ms. Mamasa, and also Stephen. But my comment is this. It's just about bureaucracy. If you are a mayor of Twan, and you are a municipal manager of Twan, somebody comes to you, is applying for a commercial license to go and build warehouses on R21. When there are warehouses in Kalinen. If somebody comes to you and asks for a license to go and build retail centers somewhere, when there are available retail premises right in town, why do you allow it? Why don't you say R21 is known to be an agricultural land? If instead of building warehouses, we want to issue an expropriation notice, it's as simple as that. We want to take that land because now you want to take it for a purpose to go and do something when there is an available entity within the municipality. So my main thing is that there is too much bureaucracy, and we must admit it now that the issue of capital deployment, we must face it. We must just face it. A professor here mentioned about some land reform in 9 offices in all provinces. Just go there and find some of the people who are hating those provinces. They would not do at all about land reform. When somebody applies, he's a beneficiary. He's applying to have let me say, land for agricultural purposes, or you want to take land from a landowner, the first thing which happens in terms of the act, not the constitution, you must look into the IDP of the municipality. You must go to a provincial office of agriculture, whether that which you want to do there is it viable. Let me tell you, the very people who are doing that, or the very people who will do that and bring a report back, they bring a report to somebody who knows nothing. We must face it that we have got the best policies, we've got the best constitution. We don't have the human capital. It's there, human capital, but we are not using it. That's what one of the problems. I mean, I cannot just comprehend it. Being a mayor or being a municipal manager, somebody saying that I want to go and build, I want a license to go and build warehouses somewhere else. When I'm hearing a lot of warehouses in Pretoria West, empty. Why don't you say, thank you very much for telling me that there is an available land. May I also inform you that there is an available premises for you to do what you want to do, but for that one, I'm issuing a notice. It's as simple as that. But we don't have people who will do that. We just don't have people who will do that. But many people available with skills, but it's the issue of catered deployment. It's just killing us. You find somebody being appointed as what? Who's the next? You know, say nurses can't do anything, but we're taking people from their specialized fields to go and do something which they're not trained to do. Now, there's the issue of Section 25, where we say compensation. Up until now, we have not yet made an argument about available resources. But Section 25 also says within the available resources. Why, if I am a municipality or a government department, the landowner says I want 20 million, I say no, within my available resources, within the budget I have, to cater for so many people with different interests, I cannot give you what you are asking me to do. And if there's an argument in court, you put the issue of within the available resources. But we're not in that. Now, instead, we went to amend the constitution without having maybe made an argument, a very strong argument. Chief Justice Moe, Chief Justice, we said all of them, they've admitted to say we have not, we don't see cases in the Concord on land. So it's there. You know, if you want to make somebody who is not empowered in terms of education, just say I'm taking you to court. You withdraw. If they won't say let's go, no, you withdraw. So let's not blame anybody. We must blame ourselves. I was in government. I've raised the same issues. I also in the National Planning Commission, I've raised the same issues. The same thing now, if you look into the policy documents of the ANC, which to be released, they're already advocating for the establishment of a department of what? I think it's of policy. You know, anything that they can do to say we must have a department. Even the Department of Land Affairs and the Department of Commerce, they can be put together. Public Works, it works for both movable and immovable property. Land Affairs is doing the same thing. Why don't you call it Department of Property Management and Technical Services? It ends there. Local government and human settlement. You know, there's a lot of things. The only thing is we always look at our organogram because I want to take somebody and put him there. Not on the interest, whether is there really a need to create this particular post.
Thank you. Professor Machek.
I want to agree that we shouldn't limit ourselves to the rural areas because in the 80s, when we were in struggle, we said that people must live near their workplaces, but we had not followed up to that. As a result, people working in Joburg are pushed something south of Johannesburg. And now for them to come to work and return home, the amount of money that they have to pay for transport is consumed by transport. People travel from Kwamhlanga in Kwandebele to work in Pretoria. They're just working for transport. So it's important that we must not limit this land access to rural areas. But there's one issue that we never touch. The fact that, early on, very early on, the land south of Sofala was occupied by the Khoisan people. They have left records of their existence on stones. And one can ask, what happened to them? What did we do to them? We exterminated, like the Americans exterminated the Red Indians, the British exterminated the other people of Australia. So until we address the question of the Khoisan people, we will not have done our job, and that must be put high on the agenda. But the last thing I want to say is on the paradigm shift. I don't think we should be understood not to be wanting the paradigm shift. As I understood the situation, we are saying no one must blame Section 25 for the failures of government to deliver the land. But also when we deal with Section 25, the future of 2065, it doesn't need opportunistic politicians who are going to call for the scrapping of Section 25 or its amendment so that they can catch more votes to be returned to power to continue doing nothing. So I think that the academics have a responsibility to continue the inquiry into whether or not we want this section in its present form. But that we needed it and we still need it cannot be disputed because we don't want chaos. We need a managed transition, managed transformation. But I'm also attracted, Ms. Mabas, about your question of moving away from individual land ownership. Because if no one is going to live for life, why do you want to own something for life? And why do you want your children to inherit what they did not work for? Why don't we say that all those who have the competence and ability to work the land, they must lease the land, work it. When you die, your children must prove that they can use the land, then the land must be leased to them. So I think that is the argument that we really need to take seriously and take forward. And we must also accept that this Section 25 was crafted because of the fear that the white minority had. But I think now, after 20 years, we know that black people are not monsters. They don't want to grab things. And actually, the fact that we have a non-racial society is because of black people. We should not fear them. But I see my Dominion there. There's a lot of land that is in the hands of the churches, They were given free of charge by Paul Kruger and John Smith. Maybe the churches, before we had this truth and reconciliation on the church, if they can just volunteer to say, we are releasing the land for the poor, and then we will have solved part of the problem. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Maybe a round of applause for the panel. And so I think we take an hour, maybe 1:45, if we could be back at 1:45, and then we will resume under the chairpersonship of Justice van der Westhuizen, the last round of engagement on the issue. Thank you very much and have a good lunch.